Telling the story. The Old Testament is like a library of books with exciting stories, poetry, and wise sayings. There are also some sad stories and many stories that help us remember God's love and care. From the first stories of creation in Genesis to the prophets at the end of this section of the Bible, in Genesis and Exodus we hear the stories of the first people God called as God's people. These two books, along with Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, make up the Torah. These are books of instruction about living in God's way. Then come 13 books of stories about God's people. You'll read about Samuel, David, Ruth, Esther, Elijah, Elisha, and many more. Psalms are poetry, and they help us know how to talk to God. The last 17 books of the Old Testament are words that God gave to the people God called to be prophets. The Old Testament is also Jewish scripture, read by Jews and Christians today. The stories were the stories that Jesus learned as a child. They are the stories in the background as he taught and healed. In these stories, you meet strong women and men such as Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Rachel, but many more strong and faithful people will step in and out of this parade of biblical characters. Listen for surprises in the stories and learn how God acts in the world, then and even today. Some people use pictures and words to make scrapbooks about things they want to remember. Maybe you have a baby book with words and pictures. It tells about your birth or adoption and the first years of your life. Or instead of a baby book, you might have a file on the family computer with all kinds of pictures. The stories in the first 4 books in this section of our Bible are like a big album full of pictures. Each story adds a picture that tells us about Jesus, how he lived, what he taught, and what we need to remember. The stories in the first 4 books were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each of them wrote in their own way to tell their stories about Jesus. You'll hear stories about how Jesus used parables to teach about God. And there are stories about how he healed people with his words and his touch. When Jesus taught and when he healed people, he wanted them to think about how they could live with one another. Jesus met a lot of interesting people: Peter, Mary and Martha, Joanna and Susanna, and Zacchaeus. And there are stories about some people whose names we don't even know. Each person was different after meeting Jesus. After Jesus died and was alive again, he left the earth, and everyone who knew him had to decide how to start all over again, living the way Jesus taught. Luke also wrote another book. It's called the Acts of the Apostles. It tells stories about the beginnings of the church. Here you'll meet people like Philip and Paul, Tabitha, Lydia, and Timothy. As you hear their stories, think about how those people are like people you know in our church. The New Testament also has many letters that people wrote to the churches and to individual people as the church was just getting started. These letters reminded these very first Christians how they were to live together, how they were to treat other people, and how they were to love like Jesus. What pictures of Jesus and the church do you want to remember? How will those pictures and stories help you remember how Jesus wants you to live in this world?